Greetings, everyone, and a warm welcome to Intersections, where we are seeking to dissolve the boundaries between life and leadership, and inner and outer, and east and west, and science and spirituality and beyond. Because it is when we dissolve these boundaries that we discover our full potential and the full potential of humanity and of life. Today, we have with us a wonderful voice of that very quest of helping to uncover both his own potential, Srinivas Rao, as well as in getting lessons and insights that as he's introspected and drawn them out, read and studied and learned about them from the outside, as well as lived them in his own life, that he can bring to us as well about what does it take to rise to our full potential. Super excited about having Srini with us. Before I invite Srini into the mix of our conversation, let me just share with you a few background parts about Srini's life, which I think will be informative for us. So he is a passionate storyteller and the founder of the Unmistakable Creative. Here is his path as described in more mainstream, professional, and academic terms. He's done a bachelor's in economics from UC Berkeley, an MBA from the Pepperdine Business School. He founded Unmistakable Media and has hosted the Unmistakable Creative podcast for more than a decade now. Has authored also 7 books and is sought after as a keynote speaker around these themes. His focus is on using the internet to make things connect people, share ideas, and tell stories. The Unmistakable Creative podcast, I was honored to be on it several weeks ago, and I just found it really powerful, the manner in which Srini was able to really help me, go within and discover more of my voice than I was doing on an average day. And I was like, Srini, you got a gift here in the way you can get this back and forth, dialogue to happen. Here are some of the other people that he's had in the podcast. It's a wide range and some very well-known people, some way off the beaten track. We're going to come back and talk more about them in the conversation I have with Srini very soon. Here are a couple of the books that he's written, An Audience of One and Unmistakable, Why Only is Better Than Best. We're going to talk more about that theme in just a few minutes. He's working to help organizations and individuals increase their productivity by expressing what is unique to them in terms of their own creative gifts. And I highly encourage you to listen to his podcast, which he's always bringing such a diverse set of voices. I wrote in my email invite for today that he had interviewed over 500 people. Actually, that number stands updated. It is over 1,000 people now that he's interviewed. And on that note, let me invite Srini into our mix. Welcome, Srini. How are you?
I am great, Hitendra. It's so great to be here with you. I enjoyed talking to you so much on Unmistakable Creative that when you asked me to come and join you to be on the other side, it was kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah, no, it's awesome that I imagine that the fact that through that moment our lives intersected and have come together on a couple of occasions since, and I've just benefited so much from knowing you and knowing about you and learning from you that you must have those kinds of experiences all the time with over 1,000 people that you've interviewed.
Well, I wish that was true. It's funny because every guest I have some semblance of a relationship with, and others they make their appearance on the show, it goes great, and that's kind of the end of it. It varies. I definitely think that one thing that we probably already had in common is the fact that we're both of Indian descent. So you automatically have this bond that kind of transcends even the conversation we're going to have on the podcast. So that just creates this sort of instant ability to relate to each other in a way that I can't always relate to other guests, because we can talk about, sort of context, cultural context when I ask questions. And for you, those things make sense. For other people, they don't. So I think that definitely makes a big difference. We've had a lot of Indian guests on the show. And to the point in your introduction, I had a professor from University of Pennsylvania as a guest. And he said, Srini, I thought I was going to come here and talk about artificial intelligence, and now you have me questioning the purpose of my life. It's like, yes, I've been known to do that to people. But I think that it's interesting. Like I joke that I'm the most well-connected person that nobody has ever heard of, and if you look at the network that I've built, there's varying degrees of depth in every relationship. People think, oh, Srini knows everybody and, he can call anybody for any favor. And that's not entirely true, but I can probably connect you to anybody who knows how to do something, like no matter what the skill is. Like if you want to run for president, I know the guy who can tell you how to do it.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Let me probe one thing you just said, because that like struck out at me when you talked about that professor from University of Pennsylvania and artificial intelligence. So when you do the podcast, you interview somebody who's had a certain signature in their life, certain something that they might be very distinctively known for, or that has drawn you to them. But then when you get into the conversation, do you do that often? Do you tend to at times make them go to unexpected places and probe and stir something that maybe evokes certain stories and ideas that they may or may not be having as part of their usual message?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want anybody to share their usual message because that's not interesting to me. One of my, sort of core ideas is that if I could, learn about what I'm going to learn in an interview from reading a blog post or reading your book, that defeats the purpose of the interview. I want to learn the things that I could never find from reading somebody's bio or looking at their LinkedIn profile. For several reasons. I mean, part of it is strategic, part of it is genuine curiosity. So the strategic part is that human beings are hardwired for story, and there's a reason NPR has what they call driveway moments, where people will sit in their driveway and just quietly listen. They can't, because the thing is, like, you press play and you cannot stop listening. And so I had a business partner, a couple of years ago, and one of the things that he told me, he said, he started analyzing the show in more detail, and as he was listening, he said, you're having these really deep conversations with people, but it's taking, anywhere between 15 to 20 minutes to get to the juiciest parts. He said, and what he said was, don't ask them about their work to start with. You'll eventually get there anyways. So, we ask very off the wall questions. I knew based on our conversation, I knew which question I wanted to start with. So I usually know where I'm going to start and where I'm going to end. And that is it. For a couple of reasons. One of the reasons I don't plan questions in advance is that in my life outside of Unmistakable Creative, I'm not the best listener in the world, which is ironic considering I've made a living listening to people. But I realized that if you don't plan questions in advance, it forces you to listen to every single person in very, very close detail. And so I plan every question is based on the answer that I get to the previous question. So, I describe it kind of like surfing, and surfing, if people, have never seen how surfers are in the ocean. If you don't know anything about surfing, what you may not know is that typically when a surfer is riding a wave, they're actually riding parallel. They're not riding straight. And basically what they're doing is they're adjusting to whatever the wave does throughout the process until they get to the end of the wave. And sometimes, you'll get 4, 5, 6 turns on a really good wave. Sometimes you'll get one and be done. So I think that to me has always been the metaphor that I've used to approach these conversations. But almost everything that I'm asking somebody will come out of genuine curiosity. So remember, I knew you had a daughter, having been raised by Indian parents, I wanted to know, from your perspective, what is it like to raise a kid who's, 10 years younger than me? Like, what are you teaching her about careers? How does that differ from what my parents taught me? And, I also realized that parenting, from what I hear, is a very complex job. And I think that I have this misperception that somehow asking all these questions about parents is going to prepare me to actually be one. But rumor has it that that's actually not true, because, kids are all unique. And so there are a lot of reasons for that. So that's the strategic part of it is very much designed to get people to listen, because, Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox News, he had this quote in, the TV show, The Loudest Voice in the Room, where he talked about how he wanted to create content that made sure people never change, people will never change the channel. And that really stayed with me. I mean, I'm not a Fox News guy. I think Roger Ailes is a horrible human being. But at the same time, I don't think that you can discount that there's something to learn from him. He built Fox News, and I'm building a media company. So in my mind, you don't overlook the value of a message just because you can't stand the messenger. It's something I learned a long time ago. So I don't agree with everything that my podcast guests say. Like I've learned that, but at the same time, if you don't seek differing viewpoints, it's very easy to get caught in an echo chamber and just take things at face value and, treat guidance as gospel. And that's to me very dangerous, because it can lead to some very bad consequences. But yeah, that's in it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of beautiful lessons just to learn for us from that, Srini. I mean, that's one thing that I'm striving to do in this show is to help our audience and myself just constantly extract like learnings that are translatable to our own lives. And I think one of the things that you just shared here, which is about the path of discovery, into an individual when you are in a dialogue, that while it might involve learning about them from the outside, it's what you can learn about them from the inside. It's about the blank canvas that you bring of just like open inquiry and discovery, and then these questions that you ask in response to what they've just shared, and therefore the conversation goes in unexpected directions. I mean, how powerful. Do you find yourself from time to time getting very, if you want to call it, stirred or like emotionally, moved, by something that you're live, like discovering and hearing and uncovering from that story? I mean, you have such a colorful set of guests. I can only imagine what it must be like to be not just merely an audience, to them, which you are when you're, doing the podcast and listening to them, but you're also, in a sense, the curator. You're also the facilitator of that, like, process of extracting the gems of their life. I mean, how is it like for you to stay in that state of both service to your audience, but also personally experiencing their, their energy in the story?
Yeah, I think that, I can literally sum it up with one sentence that, if you don't feel it, nobody else will. So I don't really think of it as, I don't think like a podcaster creating audio. I honestly think as an entertainer. And so, I think there are three components to content that has emotional resonance, right? You can educate, you can inspire, and entertain. And, in my mind, the entertainment is as a critical part of it. Like, they're not mutually exclusive, but at the same time, like, this is what I've often told aspiring podcasters, like, you have to realize that this is an entertainment medium first and an information medium second. So like, if you could go and read 10 tips on how to do something, why would you listen to two people talk about it in audio? Yeah, maybe it might be faster. Funny enough, I actually don't listen to podcasts despite being the host of one. It's my least preferred form of media consumption because I have such a short attention span. So I actually prefer reading books, but I like creating a podcast. And so, the real idea is not just, me feeling it, of course, like I want, that emotion, but I do definitely look for emotional resonance. Like, and to me, I am very clear on the fact that something has to strike, have emotional resonance with our audience, which is why I've said no to really well-known people and I've said yes to people that nobody has ever heard of, because what I'm always after is an interesting story. More than anything else, I want a good story to come out of it. And at the end of the day, like I said, I mean, I started out as a person interviewing bloggers about how they got traffic to their blogs. But the more I did that, the further we got down the path of doing this, the more I started to see that my favorite interviews were not those, but the ones with people who had interesting stories. And so more and more, the direction of the conversation started to change quite a bit. And it expanded, who you could have as guests, from bank robbers to billionaires to drug dealers to presidential candidates. And so that's a big part of it. Is really, I think what it is emotional resonance is a big part of what drives what I do. Now, keep in mind, I also have a background as a musician. I played the tuba for 9 years, and I got into the USC School of Music. I made all-state band 3 times, and it turns out that people who become writers who are former musicians have really this ability to create music with words, because when I put something on a page, even on paper, when I'm reading, I don't necessarily see words. I hear sounds. To me, I want to see that, if I can get this sort of rhythmic quality to, what I'm doing. And there are other writers who are masterful at this, far better than I am. Like my friend Sarah Peck is amazing at doing this. Amber Ray is another one. Piano players in particular, for some reason, tend to have this ability to have this very poetic, almost musical sounding voice as writers. And so I think that's very common for people who have spent a lot of time, in music of any kind. They tend to really think about words more as music. And so, just to give you an example, we did this episode called The 36 Questions and the Mystery of Love. Like, if, people who are here hadn't read it, there's an article in the New York Times about the 36 questions to fall in love with anyone. And so I actually had my roommate and the girl that he was dating at the time sit down, do the 36 questions. And we put together an episode based on that. We weaved in clips from our previous guests. And when I went to the audio engineer, I said, I have only one instruction: bring the audience to tears. And that's such a vague instruction, and yet he's good enough that he's able to do that.
Anobik, if you can find a link to that episode,
Yeah.
I think it'll be a great one to share with everybody. It's I'm aware of those 36 questions, and I am intrigued about wanting to see what you guys came up with. What a creative way to put them into application on your roommate. Awesome, Srini. You're talking about stories that emerge in these conversations, and I was wondering maybe you could at this early stage of our conversation today share a little bit, maybe like the story of Joe and Piper. I mean, it's such a compelling story. You've interviewed everyone from billionaires to bank robbers. So are you open to sharing the story of Joe and what unfolded there?
Yeah. So Joe Loya, is a guy who robbed 30 banks in about 18 months. And so funny enough, I haven't read that book. I need to. And I didn't know about the book before I interviewed him. I'd had a friend who was a previous guest who had also been in prison. Just, on a side note, people who've been to prison have really good stories. Like, they're just fascinating because you get a glimpse into this sort of dark underworld that most of us hope to never actually get a front row seat to. But we're all curious about, we kind of see it from the outside. We see it on TV shows like Prison Break and, Lock Up, and we're like, what is this actually like? And, part of what you see is true. Part of what you see is not. Like, I've interviewed a venture capitalist who started a tech incubator inside of San Quentin, and I got to actually go visit, the prisoners who were a part of his incubator. And these guys were building apps and writing code, and I'm looking at them thinking, I can't do half this stuff. And these guys are in prison. But Joe Loya was fascinating because Joe Loya was a really, really, really articulate and really smart individual. And that's not your first thought that you would think, when you talk to a guy who robs 30 banks. But, he had a rough upbringing and, eventually decided that he was just going to go on a bank robbing spree because in his mind, he thought of all the criminals that he could be, a bank robber was the best kind because he said, if you look at Hollywood, every, sort of iconic actor from George Clooney to, whoever has played a bank robber at some point. And, bank robber is not sort of, they don't have the sort of perception that people do of like murderers, right? Bank robbers are cool and hip and sophisticated and master planners. It's like Mark Wahlberg in Italian Job to, again, Clooney in Ocean's 11. So people who, pull off these huge heists, we look at them and we don't necessarily see, vicious criminals. We're like, damn, those people are really smart. And so, that was sort of his idea. And eventually he got caught. But I think what struck me most about Joe Loya was how well read he was. When we were in our conversation, he would bring up books, and I'm thinking to myself, this guy read more books in solitary confinement than I did at Berkeley. Like I went to college, he went to prison, and he's more well read. And so I think that the other thing that Joe really did was he really kind of challenged, my initial perceptions of what people in prison are like. He said that, you'd be surprised. He said people in prison are funny. There's humor. I mean, because the thing is that you have to think about the fact that, okay, somebody does something horrible and they know they're going to be in there for life. They have to find some sense of meaning. And he said, you'd be surprised, but he said sometimes the people who are lifers are the safest people in the prison to be around. And the other thing that I think that he did, and Brian, what's his name? Brian Stevenson echoed this in Just Mercy. He said, none of us are, defined by the worst thing we've ever done, but people in prison are. And, he had a friend who murdered somebody in self-defense. And he's like, you call that guy a murderer? And he said, no. He's like, he was a murderer for 2 minutes of his life, but now we've given him that label permanently. And so that, that's kind of the backstory. And, after he got out of prison, Joe Loya became a talking head on the subject of the criminal justice system. And then he started corresponding for some strange reason with Piper Kerman. I don't even know how the correspondence began. Piper Kerman, for those who don't know, is the woman who wrote Orange is the New Black, and which eventually got made into a TV show. But she actually, he would send her letters, and he actually encouraged her to write down everything that she was experiencing, to, put all of it in a journal and tell her stories. And, you've seen Orange is the New Black, parts of it are funny. It's again, to that point, you're in this environment in which you're going to have stories that you would never get in any other situation. God forbid that one of it ends up in prison, but at least they make something of it. So yeah, that's kind of Joe Loya. And I mean, we literally could take the Joe Loya interview and make a feature-length animation out of it.
Yeah, how powerful. I found that so powerful, the point about how most of us are not defined by the worst thing that we've ever done. And yet these people are. And in some ways, what a unifying thing to then seek to understand them from a more holistic lens. You also mentioned about how well read he was, and it reminded me. I was just reading the other day someone who went and studied in great detail, the books and the library, of Mahatma Gandhi and Mahadev Desai, his private secretary, and he found an enormous, set of things that Gandhi had read, and yet his schedule was so punishing. Every day he would wake up at 4 a.m. and do his prayer, and then ultimately get into the public arena for a large part of the day, etc. He barely get a few hours of sleep a night. And so he was wondering, how did Gandhi have the time to do so much reading when he was having such a punishing lifestyle? And then as he peered more deeply into those books, because these are literally the physical copies that Gandhi had, and he saw certain dog-eared pages and certain notes and certain dates and all that, and he started to correlate. And you know what he discovered? He discovered that a lot of those books had been read during the periods that Gandhi was in prison.
Yeah.
So it's exactly what you're saying. Somehow prison gives people the opportunity if they want to take advantage of it.
Yeah, well, there's nothing else to do, right? You're just stuck in a cell all day. So I mean, that's you'd be amazed how well-read people, who come out of prison are, because the ones who take advantage of it.
Yeah. So I want to, for a moment, turn the story, to you. I look at you, Srini, and in ways, many ways, as you've said, there's a common, connection we have to our roots, from the Indian origins, but I think in many other ways too, I kind of can relate to you. There you were at UC Berkeley, and my MBA students, who you actually came and did a guest lecture for just a few days ago, which they loved, right? They were relating to you, right? And yet, being in a place like that, a mainstream, solid, established, recognized university, from where most people go down very well-trekked paths of investment banking and consulting and entrepreneurship and beyond, you have gone down a very unique path. What triggered that transition from being in that kind of like a mainstream environment to becoming this very unique version of who you are?
Yeah. To be honest, more than anything else, it was necessity, right? What is that quote about necessity? It was like, necessity breeds innovation or something like that. Mm-hmm. So, I don't exactly have the most impressive job history. My resume looks more like a rap sheet. I was either fired from every job I had or left before I was going to be fired. And, part of that was because I had, I made poor choices in terms of the roles that I chose, because I think that there's this sort of temptation to choose something that looks good on paper, both, in terms of your resume and in terms of your salary. And often that ends up leading to a great deal of dissatisfaction for so many people, because they don't actually consider match quality, which is something David Epstein writes about in his book Range. And for so many of us, we're making decisions about our entire lives when we've only lived a fraction of them. So I think it would be hard for me to say, okay, follow my path, do it. In fact, I would never recommend anybody follows in my path. I think it would be the height of stupidity to do that, because, if you tell somebody, oh, go get fired from every job you've had, move back to your parents when you're 30, live with them until you're 38, and then you'll become a best-selling author, get a book deal, and start a successful podcast, that's just stupid advice. Like, that is, again, context matters here a lot. So there are two things. One is the job history. The other is timing. Timing, played a huge role in this. So I was the beneficiary and also the victim of graduating into two recessions. So I graduated Berkeley December 2000. It was a horrible time to get out of school and start a career. And then I graduated from Pepperdine in April 2009, which was an even worse time to try to start a career. You couldn't plan timing this bad intentionally. But the thing that graduating in 2009 gave me was this opportunity to be at the forefront of what was going to happen on the internet. And the summer prior, I had two job offers. One was to go work at Yahoo, and the other one was to work at Intuit as their social media intern. And I could kind of see, and neither of those were jobs that I wanted. When people would ask me what I wanted to do when I graduated from business school, I would tell them, I know one thing: as long as it has nothing to do with the internet, that's what I will do. But apparently fate and the universe have a sense of humor. So I got this job. Yeah, I wasn't very good at it, but the thing is, it gave me the opportunity to be part of a trend, or to basically be at the forefront of something that was going to actually make a big difference in our lives. And what's funny is I started a blog while I was there, and people who have read that blog, they've landed full-time jobs at Intuit, and I never got a full-time job at Intuit. So I basically provided a reference, but my boss told me at the time, at the end of the summer, that they weren't going to make an offer. And he said, "I know that you're disappointed, but trust me, we're actually doing you a favor. We'd be doing you a disservice if we hired you." So I think the one thing to think about is really how do you actually find match quality. And I think that really what it comes down to is looking at what you find engaging. So Tina Seelig at Stanford actually says that passion follows engagement. And the problem is that we tend to put the cart before the horse when it comes to passion, because we have this like vague idea that we're passionate about something. So we go and pursue a career in it. And then we think, oh, well, I'm just bad at this, or I'm not good at this, or that, you're not passionate about it. So I'll give you an example. I had a professor who in an entrepreneurship class told me that I was an incredible salesperson because I was really good at presentations, pretty much better than anybody in my class. Now, the problem with that was I took that advice so literally that I went and spent 10 years working in sales, doing jobs I hated. Turns out I am good at presentations. That's why I get paid to do keynote speeches, but that's the part that I'm good at. And it's really hard to do well at something you could care less about. To me, every job I had was just a paycheck. Like I wouldn't have cared, and I still wouldn't care if any of those companies went out of business. I'd feel bad for the people who worked there, but and that's a big problem, is you don't feel any sense of purpose or any sense of contribution. So I think there are so many factors that go into what make a career fulfilling. But truth be told, I didn't choose this path. I was forced to go down this path because all the other options were no longer on the table. I didn't have the grades to be a banker or a consultant. I didn't go to a top 10 business school. And I graduated into multiple recessions, and then layer on top of that a resume that looks like a rap sheet. I was definitely not going to get anywhere going down the traditional path.
Yeah. There's something really powerful you said to build on this in my class around the doors in front of us, the ones that close and the ones that may be undiscovered.
Yeah.
Can you share that?
Yeah, of course. So the idea behind that was that, you don't want to let the options in front of you blind you to the possibilities that surround you. And the thing is that for the most part, all of us are blind to the possibilities that surround us, because what do we do in life? People put options in front of us. You basically are in high school, and then your parents come to you with a list of colleges where you can apply. So you now have a set of options in front of you. You narrow down those options. Then you go to college and you meet a counselor or somebody who basically gives you more options that are put in front of you, which are your classes and the majors. And then those majors become narrower and narrower. And basically what happens is the options become even more limiting, because like these are the majors that lead to these paths. And I remember thinking when I first got to Berkeley, I was like, this is supposed to be the ultimate expression of liberalism and creativity, but the place is actually a breeding ground for conformity, as most Ivy League and prestigious schools are, because you go there thinking I'm going to have this really original, innovative experience, and then you find out that every single person that is in your class is a future banker, lawyer, doctor, or engineer, and you're like, wait a minute, we've limited our careers to 4 paths. I remember my dad asking one of my uncles about his son, saying, so what? And he was in high school. He's asking, what does he want to study? Does he want to, study computers, be a lawyer, be an engineer, be a doctor? I was like, you've limited this kid's option to 4 choices before he's even lived, a quarter of his life. And my uncle said the only thing he cares about now is girls. I'm like, great, that's all he should care about. He's a teenager, And so I think that's the thing. Like, we make these choices in our lives like we're picking, items off of a fast food menu. So even the process of applying for a job is very similar. What do? You go to a job board like a LinkedIn, or, if you're a student at a top school, you go to your recruitment center. And so basically what happens is people have put so many options in front of you that you don't recognize any of the other possibilities that surround you. Now, the thing is, like I said, for me, all those doors shut, so it was easy. I had no choice but to start looking for them.
Yeah. So maybe there's something really powerful there for any or all of us to learn, which is when you do have doors shut on you, maybe because of the state of the economy, maybe because of something you were really keen to pursue, but somehow it didn't fructify for you. Maybe that's just life and nature inviting you to look in the right direction, the direction that will make you uniquely who you are. And you call that unmistakable. So talk to us a little bit about this theme of unmistakability.
Yeah. Well, I think it probably helps to give you some context of how we arrived at this idea. So this is something that I see a lot of people struggle with. They, when they're trying to build brands or trying to come up with a mission or a message, they, go through all these exercises and they read all these books and they get frustrated that, oh, I don't have a tagline. I don't have, this or that. And what I realized was that a lot of this tends to get revealed through the work that you do. So, by the time we came up with the idea for Unmistakable, I'd already been working on this for 3 or 4 years. So we started out as I mentioned, as a podcast for bloggers called Blogcast FM, and I was interviewing bloggers about how they grew their blogs, and eventually it kind of got uninteresting. But one of my friends actually said that, there two female podcast guests told me things that really stayed with me. One was Justine Musk, who happens to be Elon Musk's ex-wife. And she said that, if you have a bold and compelling point of view, it's going to piss people off. And that is so true. And then, my friend Tara McMullen, she said, there's great creative potential in the things that make you angry. And I just started to notice a pattern that I couldn't help but criticize, where what I kept seeing, particularly with bloggers and online marketers, is they would sign up for some course, they would follow the advice of the person who created the course to the letter, and then they would wonder why they weren't getting the same results. And it was so obvious to me that it's like, wait a minute, you're the blatantly obvious variable that is going to throw off any formula for success for that. And any prescriptive advice by nature is flawed because of the fact that once you put it in the variable of the person following that advice, it falls apart, because again, context matters. It's like every single person here, as you mentioned, could go and do LeBron James's training routine every single day. They could follow his diet, and none of them, including me, are going to make it to the NBA. No offense to those of you in the chat, unless any of you are amazing basketball players, forgive me. But that's the thing. Like, we don't think in terms of context. We ignore probability. And so I just kept seeing this pattern. And, there's a great sketch from the Daily Show where Dimitri Martin goes in to see, this woman to do a story on life coaching. And so he goes in and he talks to a life coach, and then he talks to one of her clients. And at the end of it, she basically said, she's like, so he asked her, have you seen a difference in your life since going to a life coach? And she says, yeah, I'm now a life coach. And to me, that was just that was basically a mainstream media example of the trend that I kept seeing. And I thought, this is insane. People are robbing themselves and the world of the very thing that makes them stand out, because they're trying so damn hard to fit in. And so I think for me, it was always, when I looked at what other people did, it was always, okay, how do I do something different, or how do I do the opposite? And so, truth be told, and then finally, my friend Mars Dorian was the one who was able to really put it into words. I always joke that I should have given him my book advance, which I will never do. But he, so Mars Dorian has this really unique style where anytime you see his work roll through your news feed, or even if whether it was me or another client, you could take one look at it and you could say, okay, I know who did that, Mars, because it was that unique. And he said, I wanted to create things that were so unique that I never had to put my name on them, that would be immediately recognized. And the reality is, there's no competition for that. So when we need something done by him, we literally can't find anybody else to do what he does, because it's so hard to replicate the way he thinks and the way he creates what he does. And to me, that was inspiring. And so eventually that became the idea of Unmistakable. Really truly came from him. It was more, hey, how do you create something so distinctive that it's immediately recognized as your work? And that just was so inspiring to me, to the point where we built our brand around that message. And you've seen my content. Like, if our content rolls through your Facebook newsfeed, everybody knows it's like, oh, the people who did that are the Unmistakable Creative team. And that's what we wanted, a very distinctive signature. And I thought that was the way that other people should do their work too. I mean, nowadays, this is something I wish I had managed to put in the book, but I didn't think of it until, years after I wrote the book, which is what happens to people, because you start to rethink your ideas, and you might even disagree with some of what you wrote when you go back and read it. But I said, standing out in the world today is not even a matter of success. It's a matter of survival. If you don't stand out, you're not going to just linger in obscurity. You're eventually going to become obsolete. Hitendra, I can't hear you. Your mic is muted.
Thank you. There's something incredibly powerful in what you're saying, and I just want to kind of like distill that and put that back into our collective consciousness, and then allow my audience and you to react to it. So folks, feel free to as well in chat share comments and share questions here for Srini. Like this if you can, for sharing it with your social media friends as well. This is going to be a joyful ride for the next 30 minutes. So you have said that, look, think about it. Most of us in our pursuit of, great achievement and success tend to get very quickly slotted into a few very countable paths in terms of the kinds of roles and professions and majors that we have to pursue. And yet there could be a world of other opportunities that lie way beyond. And in your case, you discovered that by having certain doors shut on you. And then you said that when you actually started to walk in those different directions, one thing you uncovered is how people are not taking advantage of the fact that there is some very distinctive signature that each of them brings. And maybe that is their life's, greatest and most heroic opportunity and inspiration, which is, what is your unique signature? Discover it and then forge a path to expressing it in a way that, allows you to meet your material needs and, and get to a meaningful place, but by being the distinctive thing that is you. Mm-hmm. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that, it's funny, as you said, discover and express. I was thinking, I was like, okay, I have a tendency to want to make up mental models. So I'm like, okay, what could I create from that? Like, I was like, I got, an acronym now forming in my head. I was like, discover, express, what comes next in this process?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's true. Like, first is this process of discovery, and then comes this process of expression. And, from expression, you basically build from there. And you can't always predict what's going to happen. Now, let me, sort of caveat all of this, with something, and it takes us back to context. I think that one of the things that I think people have done wrong, particularly in the world that I have been in, is that we have almost this sense of superiority. Like, there's a sort of sense of superiority to people who don't have, these unique paths or, lifestyle design or whatever. And that's nonsense. For some people, the paths they've chosen are perfectly acceptable. I think that we have put so much emphasis on extraordinary achievement that we have planted seeds of dissatisfaction in people's lives where there were none before. And so, I say, like, who's to say that, having a 9-to-5 job, living in the Midwest and raising a family isn't a perfectly good life? We need to acknowledge that as well, without sort of creating the sense of superiority of, hey, I do this unique and original thing, so everybody should, because it's not realistic for everybody. For somebody who has had a very difficult life, they have to make ends meet. And so this is something that I think I've become hyper aware of, is that so much of what I talk about, what I like encourage and even create, is ultimately catered for people who come from privileged backgrounds, and as much as I hate to say that, it's true. We can't ignore that. It's kind of funny. I saw, somebody here from Chandigarh, where, I happened to go there last year, or I think, it was in 2019. And, I had this guy who drove me around because, if you've ever driven to the mountains in India, it's a nightmare. It's like the same drive that takes 2 hours in Los Angeles takes 13 because the roads are so bad. And I remember, having multiple conversations with this guy, and, we were asking him, so what is this life like? And I can't help but think, I was like, this guy makes this trek up from Chandigarh to Manali, like, what, three times a week, 13 hours on treacherous mountain roads. And I thought to myself, like, that's a hard life. That's a guy who doesn't have upward mobility. And I think from him, like, I saw there's a real difference between imagined obstacles and real ones. And the truth is that it made me also hyper aware of what privileged circumstances that I was coming from. Like, this is a guy who drove us around, and he wouldn't even eat at the restaurants we did. Like, he would ask us, hey, can you guys decide what you want to eat for dinner? Because I can't afford to eat where you guys are at, and I need to go to a restaurant that's going to close. So, it's just, you see moments like that, and you kind of realize that, okay, wait a minute, we can talk a lot about purpose and passion, and it's easy to forget that these are things that only people of privilege can really worry about.
Yeah. Let me kind of explore this question with you a little bit further. So there is each of us, and there are the conditions in which we have been thrust, and then there's this stirring within. How do you sort of envision the fit aspect of it between what we are, hungering or drawn to or inspired by from within, versus what humanity at that point in its history and in the local conditions that we are thrust may be needing from us?
So the way that I would break this down, I actually ended up writing a piece on Medium titled "Why Outliers Are Bad Role Models for Most of Us," because by definition they're anomalies, right? You can't use Bill Gates as a role model, because how many of us were born to a relatively wealthy family that happened to be going to a private school that gives us access to a computer center, and be born at a time before this, computer revolution began. So, my old mentor, Greg, used to say that we tend to focus on possibility of accomplishing things, but we ignore probability. So the example he gave is, that we could all go to, we're talking about making the Olympics. He said, if you and I were training for the Olympics and we made it, that would be amazing. And he said, it was like, what could we do in the Olympics? And our joke was curling, because that just looked like the most ridiculous thing. And I'm guessing people who are Olympic curlers would probably balk at that, because it's probably much harder than, it looks. But the thing is, the probability of, back to the LeBron James example, the probability that, I will make it to the Olympics, my old mentor would make it to the Olympics, is virtually zero. And yet people often choose to go and pursue goals where they have no inherent advantages, where they have no skills. And it takes us back to that whole, sort of delusion that, oh, I'm passionate about this thing, so I'll probably get good at it. Whereas I think that if you get good at something first, then you actually have, more of a likelihood of discovering an opportunity to express it in a way that, allows you to get paid. So as I told you, I don't listen to podcasts. People would ask me if I was passionate about podcasting. No, I mean, I got interested in it because I did it. I found it engaging. I enjoyed it. And as a result, the more I did it, the better I got. But I think that that's, really something, you have to think about when it comes to this. You've got this sort of stirring within, and also, the world out at large, and you can't ignore reality, and I think that this is what, is one of the big problems in, the space that I'm in. I'm writing a new book right now called Not Another Damn Self-Help Book, because I am questioning a lot of what I've learned, even from my own podcast guests, where I think that if you take this advice at face value, it's really dangerous. I think that the 4 things I said I've learned from my guests are: 1, to never treat their advice as gospel, only guidance, to question what they tell me in the context of my own life. And then, 2 others, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But I think that it's really important that we look at, any advice you get, prescriptive advice from self-help books, advice from parents, and you consider that advice in the context of your life. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself making bad decisions that sound good. And there's so much bad advice. There's another piece I published on Medium, which is an excerpt from a book called "Bad Advice That Sounds Good" in self-help books, TED Talks, and podcasts. And follow your passion, to me, is at the top of that list. And I think that anytime anybody says everybody should do something, you should assume that person is full of shit, because there's nothing everybody should do. And online marketers are notorious for saying things like this.
Yeah. One of the things I relate this back to is how you were telling my students something about how it's really important to think about the things that you leave out from your resume, rather than to describe and see yourself in terms of your professional pursuits, etc., just by the kinds of things that most people habitually put on their resume. I look at, for example, just my wife and how much heart and soul she's put into, just kind of raising my daughter. And I just see that as like one of her most creative acts. There is so much more to her creativity, and it, has benefited me and my daughter so much, as a family. And even Mentora, the institute that I run, where she is a marvelous contributor as well. But just seeing my daughter as really, in a sense, the the blank canvas that we were given to produce some life, and how it has been so beautifully painted, in a sense, by my wife, in the manner in which she has initially, of course, just born this child, and over time, care given and guided her. So, and that's not something that typically people put on their LinkedIn, resume. So, what are some other, things that you've seen people from like this audience, that you speak with, who have been able to kind of like go way off the beaten path and, and generate some incredible breakthroughs in terms of the level of fulfillment and attunement to their authentic core?
Well, let me start by using what you said about your wife as a jump off point. And for some reason, this seems to be coming up in my conversations a lot lately. Is people tend to underestimate the value of what they already know and overestimate the value of what they don't know. And I think that a mother is such a great example. And I was watching this TV show, Brothers and Sisters. Which I tend to watch TV shows. Even if I've seen every season, I'll watch the same show multiple times years later. And there was this brilliant moment in that show where she's trying to raise money for a charity, and she's basically been a stay-at-home mother her entire life. And so, the investor basically says, look, and the only reason he agrees to go and meet her for dinner is because he was friends with her husband, who had been a successful entrepreneur. But when he says that, I'm concerned about, your lack of experience, this was her response, which was so brilliant. She said, I organized the schedules of 5 extremely well-rounded children. I ran carpools, bake sales, and bluebird groups. I negotiated, coddled, and mandated all at the same time, not to mention what I had to do for my husband to keep him happy and productive. And I did all of this without taking a sick day. The problem is no one values the experience of a stay-at-home parent, which is truly a shame, because running this big enterprise, as you put it, would be a day at the beach for me. When I read that, I purposely wrote that down because it struck me so much that, we tend to undervalue so much of what we already bring to the table. So that's a really, I think, an important starting point of saying, okay, like what do I have here that is actually worth, bringing here? Because we tend to underestimate, what we're capable of, and we underestimate what we already know. Look, I think that Sally Field's quote is really indicative of the fact that your wife could probably run my company better than I ever could, because I think raising a child is far more complex than building a company. And so, but I think that to me is one thing. So as far as the resume goes, part of the reason I started to look at a resume very differently was because my resume was useless. It was not going to open doors. And we were in a really tough time in 2009 where, the average recruiter was getting 1,000 resumes, for a position from people who were incredibly overqualified. And so the thing that happened was we just kind of said, okay, you have to stand out in some way. And I knew that, the problem with the resume in my mind was that a resume is, things you say you know how to do, but it's not tangible evidence. And I'm the master of spinning bullet points into bullshit, because, when you get fired from as many jobs as I have, you learn how to be really good at interviewing for jobs and basically spinning it all so you can get the next one. Like I said, I was good at getting jobs. I was terrible at keeping them. And so that's the thing. I knew how to work that system, but ultimately, it didn't work. So that's one thing. But as far as looking at a resume, part of the reason I think that a resume is so limiting is because there's so much more to every single person, as I said to your MBA students, than you could possibly express through bullet points on a resume. If you're this dynamic, creative, innovative individual, there's so many better ways to showcase that than, a list of things you say you knew how to do, or a list of things you've done in your past. And the thing is, you can't, in my mind, that's almost like resting on your laurels. So the other thing is, when you have a body of work, it's tangible evidence of the things you say you know how to do. And not only that, if you get fired or let go from your job, you can take that body of work with you anywhere. So I think the thing that makes a body of work different than a resume is that it increases in value over time. The more you add to it, the more it compounds. Whereas a resume is stagnant. It's a static document. Whereas a body of work is dynamic. It changes and evolves. And again, like most people know me for my podcast, but I've done all sorts of other things unrelated, as you mentioned. Keynote speaking, writing books. I've also started working on animation. I actually didn't get into this because I wanted to start podcasts. I wanted to make movies. I wanted to be in entertainment and make films. And in some sort of roundabout way, I'm getting to kind of do what I wanted to, but in a very different form.
I love this idea about creating your own body of work. And especially in a time like this, when we are all so empowered by the access to new media and vehicles through which to create those expressions. I just think that that's a clarion call, for any or all of us to take. And so I'm thinking here that if I had to kind of like unpack that, what that might look like, and, tell me if this makes sense to you, Srini. I'm kind of like thinking on my feet here, but it's something about like, figure out what your message is, figure out what your medium is in terms of the language of expression, which could be different for different people. For you, it has turned into a new media, a podcasting, and a book writing in a kind of form, right? And then of course figure out what your audience is and how you're seeking to then serve that audience through that message in that medium. Yeah,
Well, I'm glad great. Now I have something to write about this morning. You articulated something that we had a course on how to build an audience, and I talked specifically about choosing your medium of expression. But I love the idea of thinking in terms of those three areas. What's your message? What's the medium in which it's best expressed? And who's the audience that it serves? Like, those are three very important questions, because certain people are really good on video. I'm not. My videos are full of F-bombs and outtakes, and it just gets frustrating. Fortunately, video editing is getting easier now. But that's why I like podcasts, because it's easy to edit. It's quick to create. And writing is kind of the same. It's just, again, certain people, I will tell you, I am a far better interviewer than I am a writer. And anybody, that's what actually prompted starting the podcast. One of, my 13th guest, I had emailed him about starting some sort of multi-author blog, and he replied back saying, he sent this lengthy email. So soapbox, basically, you're an average writer, but you're a great interviewer. So I think that, this multi-author blog is a stupid idea. I think you should do the podcast or these interviews, spin it out into a separate site. And an hour later, I mocked up a WordPress website, sent it back to him and said, is this what you had in mind? When do you want to start?
Yeah, amazing. I want to challenge that, by the way, folks, in terms of Srini's claim that he's a better this than he's a writer, because here it is. I'm just going to read a quote from you, Srini. I think it's really powerful. Creation is its own reward. Unmistakable work is what the world deserves. So charge each wave with everything you've got. Go make something unmistakable. Paddle back out to the lineup. Take a deep breath and do it again. You were born to be unmistakable. I find that very inspiring.
Well, I had an amazing editor and writing coach. Let me just say that. It helps. That's the other thing, right? Is that I really early on, I started to figure out that I could compensate for my weaknesses by working with other people. That's really, really big in all of this, because nobody accomplishes anything of significance without the help of other people. It's just, they don't, look around, whether you're a parent, whether you're, a kid, think about where you are in your life, and, ask yourself if any of what you have done would have been possible without somebody's help. Whether it's your parents, whether it's a friend, and I saw this particularly because I didn't have necessarily any artistic skill, but I realized that if I had a vision for something, other people could execute that vision. And so that's kind of what ended up, happening with the creative brand. I can't draw any of this stuff. Somebody else does it.
Yeah.
I know what I want it to look like.
Very nice. We'll show some of these visuals. You've got obviously a very distinctive visual signature in your podcast, and sounds like, you've teamed up, with great talent there. So now I'm seeing the building blocks being about the message, the medium, the audience, but also a team.
So I would say, if we were to break this down, say message, medium, let's go, I wouldn't even think of it as an audience as much as I would a community, right? Because if you think about it as an audience, you kind of start to see eyeballs instead of hearts, and I can't take credit for that. Austin Kleon talks about this, that, he says he basically makes this distinction. And so if you think about sort of typical, media creation, there's this idea of reach and eyeballs and metrics. And, let me just, give you an example that I tend to recite, frequently to the people in my community. So Seth Godin has probably one of the most popular blogs, if not the most popular blog on the internet. Millions of people read it every day. Now, BuzzFeed is a wildly popular website. If BuzzFeed went out of business tomorrow, I don't think that many people would give too much of a shit. If Seth Godin didn't publish a blog post tomorrow, there would be one reason. It's because he's dead. And there would be tributes all over the blogosphere to Seth Godin, because he didn't focus on eyeballs. He focused on hearts, and he has this relationship with his audience. And that's what he's always been focused on. And so I think that, thinking of the audience as a community or a tribe is a much better way to view it, because then you see them as people, not numbers. And that's really key, is, knowing who these people are is really important. So I would say, message, medium, team, community.
Yeah. That's beautiful. When you get to have to build that team, how do you make those hard calls about how much you can let go, of the control over what you think is the authentic expression of what you're trying to kind of do?
Okay, so this is a great question, and it's something that when you make the transition from founder to CEO, especially when you have an investor, a lot of things start to change, and you have to learn how to delegate in a way that you're not micromanaging and also not compromising the quality of your work. And you're going to make mistakes along the way. You're going to have bad hires. Yeah, but there are a couple, and again, this is all stuff I've stole from other people, so I can't take credit where, like for any of this. But I think cardinal rule number one is to hire slow, fire fast. I think that there's always this temptation to say, okay, let's get somebody on board as quickly as possible because we need to fill this role. But that usually is always, a recipe for disaster. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in my own business where we bring on somebody thinking that they're perfect. And sometimes they start out strong and then we realize that, they're just not capable of what we want them to do. And when you're on a lean team that's as small as ours, we need people who can navigate ambiguity, do, as much work as they can with very little direction. So, I was looking for a community manager when we raised our round of funding. And I looked around on LinkedIn, all these people like social media backgrounds emailed me and contacted me, and I used the, job description my investors helped me write. And I was like, these people are all completely unqualified to do this job. And they're going to come in with their own ideas of what they want this to be. I was like, we need somebody from within our community. And so I contacted a friend who, I'd seen, she would write these summaries of our podcasts, and they were better than any summary that I'd ever written. And I'm the host of the show. And so I contacted her and I said, hey, I'm looking for a community manager. And she said, Srini, I don't need a job. And two, I'm a civil engineer without a PhD. And I told her, I was like, if you can build a bridge, you can build a community. All that tells me is you're smart and you know how to solve problems. And I was like, I'm not, asking you if you need a job. I'm begging you to join our team because I know I just knew. And, and I gave her incredibly vague direction and she basically hit the ground running. I mean, my joke is that when it comes to running our community, I report to her, not the other way around. I literally just have a meeting with her. She tells me what to do, and that's it. And so I think bit by bit, you learn to let go. The other part of this is having systems that, then this is really a big one, right? Because a business, like any area of life, is an interdependent system with inputs and outputs and, bottlenecks and all this other stuff. So you really have to think about it like you're building a factory and really creating an assembly line where, the only part of it that is creative is the part that you do. Like, I'm the most useless employee at my company because I don't do anything other than interview people and write, at this point. And, that was prior to like speaking, before COVID speaking, but I do three things of value for my company. But the thing is that, Seth Godin wrote this book called Lynchpin, and he had a really great quote. He said, any one of you could do Richard Branson's job, except for about 5 minutes a day, because it's in those 5 minutes that he creates billions of dollars in value. So, the value I create happens in about an hour a day. Anybody else could do the rest of this job because all it is basically crossing, T's and dotting I's. And, it's not as complex. But the thing is, there are all these other dynamics. So this is why I joke that business school doesn't teach you a damn thing about running a business. No offense, Hitendra. But the thing is, you get out of business school and you start a business and you suddenly start to see that, oh, wait a minute, unlike the case study that we did, in my class, this is actually dynamic. The variables are constantly changing. I have to deal with idiots who are unmotivated. I have to deal with, people who have big egos. Like, you can't account for any of those variables in a case study. You can only kind of assume those things. So you have all these variables that basically throw the whole thing out of whack. And so people, come out of business school, they start businesses and they start to take these business school concepts and try to apply them to their business. And suddenly they don't, they find that they don't work. And it's like, yeah, of course they don't work because you're now dealing with reality, not, static pieces of paper or things that you've learned in books. You're basing your, strategy on something that worked for like some Fortune 500 company, and you're, a startup of one person.
So, I mean, everything you're saying makes me visualize you as this, just creative, unmistakable production machine, just putting out just a disciplined, volume of content over time, engaging, connecting, appealing to the hearts of your tribe. What do you do to stay connected with your soul? What practice have you found most important and valuable for you to make sure you're taking those inner dives, right, on a regular basis?
Yeah, so that's really important. Pre-COVID, it was a lot of snowboarding, although I'm finally getting back up on the mountain now. Like, I bought a midweek season. So I usually have a snowboarding season pass every year. Surfing, you mentioned the Unmistakable book. Surfing has been a huge part of this entire journey. I think partially because it was where I got a lot of my best ideas, but I think, it was this parallel. I don't think it's a coincidence that both, my surfing and, creative journey started almost, at the same time, because one fuels the other. And the thing is, as a surfer, you suddenly change a lot of things about yourself. You have a reason to get up in the morning. Surfers get up super early. And so if you want to be up at 6 a.m. to go get good waves, that means no more staying out till 2 a.m. getting drunk and, that kind of stuff. So your habits start to change. I mean, bit by bit, I think that what happens is that when you find something like that grounds you, it creates a ripple effect into every other area of your life. And so I just became a healthier person. Like when I was surfing regularly, I was at, my most ideal, I was in better shape than I ever was in college. Somebody mentioned Indian matchmaking here. I had friends who contacted me from college saying, dude, what the hell? How have you not aged? You look exactly the same. And I was like, surfing, it's a fountain of youth. That's the thing about water sports. I think that whatever it is, you need some sort of practice, that grounds you. And for me, that was always surfing, with COVID and all that, meditation. The other thing is, I think you need, leisure things. This is one thing I've realized just over the last couple of days when we think about sort of productivity, creativity. It's almost like we approach this from a place of guilt and, think, oh, I'm not productive. But the whole point of being productive is not to get things done. It's to enjoy the rest of your life so you can binge, Bling Empire on Netflix guilt-free. So for me, it's, video games the evening for 3 hours a night. I play NBA basketball. So yeah, I think that actually this is a metaphor that I would describe it. And I think I shared this through class, and it was this idea of a portfolio of meaning, because the thing is, and I learned this actually from a guest who had written a book called How to Be Single and Happy. And she said, that your person can't be your everything, because she's like, that's like betting your happiness on one risky stock and so, there's a reason investors have diversified portfolios, because if one stock tanks, it doesn't tank the entire portfolio. And I think that that's true for life as well. So you never want one thing to be the sole source of your happiness and fulfillment, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a job, whether it's money, whatever it is. It needs to actually be a combination of things. And the thing is that those things are never going to be completely in balance. Think about somebody who has kids for the first time. They think that, oh, I'm going to have, all this joy to my life. It's going to be amazing. This is what I want more than anything in the world. And then reality sets in, and, first, a year, this kid doesn't sleep, let you sleep. So you're sleep deprived. By the time they become a teenager, you're dealing with an angst-ridden asshole, like most of us were to our parents. And you're like, oh, this is not the just bastion of joy that I thought it would be. Parts of this suck, and that's, one thing that one of my mentors told me. He said, no matter what you get in life that you want, something about it will suck. So he said, let's say you want to be famous. Right. Or you want your own TV show. He said, great. You know what sucks about that? Now you can't go out to a restaurant without people bothering you. And we don't think about the downsides to any of the things that we want, but there are downsides to everything. There are trade-offs and opportunity cost to every single choice that you make.
You talk about the celebrity, experience and the downside to that. And you mentioned how, Kirti has found one of those, kind of chapters in her own life. Indian Matchmaker was, for those of us who are not aware, was, it's been a show on Netflix. And our own good man, Srini, was featured in it. I remember the first time my wife heard that I was going to be on your show, and then she saw your picture, and I was like, I recognize him. So how was that experience for you in the spotlight?
So there are numerous things, and I've written about this. I actually wrote an article right after the show came out titled "The South Asian Arms Race for Impressive Cultural Biodata." I went into this whole thing with zero expectations, because I knew right from the start that if I go into this with expectations, it's going to be a recipe for disappointment. The other thing that I think that I brought to it was the fact that I knew how media worked. I understood how media can shape public perception. I was hyper aware that, and I was just writing about this morning. I said, you have to realize that, they say anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. And the same is true on a reality TV show. So anytime I have to sign a contract that has something to do with media, I have a cousin who's a media attorney look at it, and he gave me some priceless advice. He said, it doesn't matter what this media release says. He said, anybody can make you look like an asshole in the editing. He said, your job is to make sure they have zero ammo to do that. And that was priceless. The other was from my cousin, because I found out that I was going to have to sit in the car with a matchmaker for an hour, and she said, dude, do what you do best, interview her. And so for those of you who saw the show, you'll notice she got 0 questions in on me. And that was entirely by design, because I knew that if she cornered me, I would get chatty. And, Robert Greene and the 48 Laws of Power says the more you say, the more likely you are to say something stupid or something you'll regret. And I knew that going in. And, I think a lot of people didn't think about the fact that, by the way, the things I'm saying are going to shape the perception of me as a public figure once this is done. And so, I think that was important. And, people are like, oh, Srini took the high road. It's like, no, I just knew how to manipulate public perception because I understand power dynamics. I didn't say a damn thing when I was called a loser because I knew that if I said nothing, the person saying all these horrible things about me would just dig themselves into a deeper hole. It's, I literally just was writing about this morning. I said, when you're tempted to retaliate, show restraint, and you'll be the one that actually stays in power. So overall, so here's what I think is important. All that aside, like those are the dynamics of media. I think this started a conversation that people who grew up here, Indians in particular, should have started 20 years ago. We're having a conversation that we know, and people will talk about how many cringeworthy moments there are in the show, and the reason they're cringeworthy is that we have, all of us who are Indian, experienced one of those moments. It's like, oh, you're too dark. It's like, yeah, go to hell. Like literally, the summer I started surfing, my parents' friends, would see me as like, oh my God, you've gotten so dark. And I told my mom, I was like, next time I see one of them, I'm gonna be like, oh my God, you've gained a lot of weight since I last saw you. Would that be okay? She's like, no. I'm like, exactly. I was like, there's no etiquette here. But I think what we did, we called out a lot of issues. I think we started a conversation that we should have started a long time ago. Right. That's the biggest thing that came out of it. Now, matchmaker aside, like I personally, at this point, I've joked that hiring Seema to be my matchmaker would be like hiring Hannibal Lecter to operate on a family member, because I literally told her that I was a surfer and she matched me with a girl who said she hates the beach. I was like, clearly you're not good at this job. So,
Yeah. So thank you. That was a colorful chapter, and I know my family. I'm not much of a TV watcher, but they were watching the show and they enjoyed that connection with you. So we're coming to a point where we have to, painfully so, start to wrap up and bring this to closure. In closing, then, 2 things. One is, what's your one big message for our community here, for our tribe here, that they can take back and reflect on, something that they can take back and perhaps reflect and act on. And the second is, what's your next big dream in life?
Well, okay, so let me just kind of say this. I think that it goes back to something I said earlier. When you listen to advice from anybody, myself included, professors, parents, authors of self-help books, seminar leaders, spiritual teachers, you really need to look at that advice in the context of your own life, because what's true for me might be nonsense for you. And I learned this actually from, a mother who who was one of my courses. And, I give all this productivity advice, and one of my mentors called me out and he said, dude, you haven't been in an office for 10 years. And he said, you don't have any kids. And she would show up with an infant in tow. And I thought, oh, who doesn't have an hour a day? And I realized, well, if you're a mother with an infant and a 3-year-old, you probably don't have an hour a day. And so I realized that I had to even think about whatever I said, to people, and specifically tell them, this is literally what I have told people in my courses that I'm teaching, is to consider the possibility that every single thing I've said is absolute bullshit, because it might be for them, because of context. So that's the thing that I would say, people should take away from this conversation, is to not listen to anything that I've said and assume that it's necessarily valid. As far as, sort of what the next big dream is, we brought up Netflix. I never wanted to, I don't want to ever be known for being a reality TV personality. I want people to know me for what I've done with Unmistakable Creative. But, funny enough, we were talking to Netflix at one point through a talent agent at CAA. When I saw the David Letterman show on Netflix, I couldn't help but think that's what I want to do. I want to do an interview show like that. And, my roommate, who is now my roommate, actually said, well, what's to prevent you from doing it? And he said, you have an audience, you have access to interesting people in droves. And so we basically put in, just a quick note on the podcast, you saying, hey, is there anybody who could help us make this happen? And the one person who replied was a talent agent at CAA. And so, who happened to be a listener. And so, we shopped it around. They weren't quite, into it, because they said we just weren't big enough. So, that still is long-term. That would be the ultimate dream, would be to basically take this to a bigger media platform like a Netflix, and to get to do it. Because the thing that I think TV gives you that audio doesn't is the ability to basically paint a much different picture. Like, I think the thing that I loved most about Letterman was, you look at the interview he did with Malala, like we got to see, her actual life. Like we got to see, where she lived. And like, I'd mentioned this friend Mars Dorian. So he basically grew up right after the Berlin Wall fell. And I, like, in my mind, I'm thinking if I ever get to do a TV show with him, the episode would start at, the site of the former Berlin Wall, like what, because his, all his art is such a utter disregard for authority. So and you can't do stuff like that in audio, and then so I think that's one thing that I really, it's still, a dream of mine is to basically get to do this in a television platform.
That's beautiful. It reminds me of a moment with one of my mentors where he was, just guiding me a little bit about how to be patient, but how to still keep the effort going in terms of converging to the right purpose, to the right direction in life in a very thoughtful and mindful and personally sort of driven way. And he just kind of like made this shape like of a triangle, a gradually kind of step by step, like convergent kind of path, in life, not one which is like this or not one which is like this, it's open-ended. That's what I see in you, Srini. I see something that started, perhaps in your childhood, and certainly by the time you were in Berkeley, that initially certain doors were closed, but certain new directions were opened up, and then you discovered all this wealth within, and then gradually it's been given more shape and more definition and more form and more texture, right? And now you're getting a little bit closer and closer towards building on that momentum.
Well, and then that's the thing. Like we're at this point where now everything is about how do you scale. Like that's the question, because like the hard part is done. We have more content than people could consume in a lifetime at this point, and we're continually creating more. And so ideally, like in a dream world, I would love it if somebody like HBO acquired us, because that would be, in a lot of ways fantastic, because we could take everything we've done in terms of our content and we'd have a platform to turn it into television, because you've heard the episodes on our show. Many of them could be TV shows and movies on their own.
Yeah. Perfect. So beautiful. Folks, thank you so much for joining us today in this conversation with Srini. We look forward to having you back in a couple of weeks, Srini. This has been highly illuminating and so inspiring to see you live your own truths. Very grateful for that. And stick on, folks, for a final quote from Srini, which I really liked and which we are going to put up here on the screen for you to enjoy as well. All the best to you, Srini, as you keep going down this wonderful and unmistakable path.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, cool. Hey, folks, I think we're having a little bit of a technical issue with the quote, but we're going to put it up, for you guys. Send it in, Anubik, if you can, put it in chat. If you can put it up, I'd appreciate it now. But otherwise, let's